This meeting is being recorded.
Yep. So welcome, and this is the first of 4 classes of Introduction to Zen. And you three I know have been around a while and probably know a lot about it, but I think sometimes it's okay for more experienced students to kind of go through the basics again. And this is kind of my take on it from my history. I don't know. I'll give you a little history about me first. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest of the US in Seattle, and lived there 50 years before I moved down to Salt Lake City. So I still kind of like to go up there sometimes. I miss the ocean smell, the salt water and the trees and all that, although I like Utah a lot too. I live here in Utah, just south of Salt Lake City, about 20 miles, in a town called Sandy. And it's my wife, Jenny, and my daughter, Celeste, who's 10. And my mom has lived with us for about the last 8 or 9 years. She's 97. And she's doing well. We all think she's going to make it to 100 pretty easy. And so that's my life here. And then, of course, as you know, I run a lot of stuff for Kanzian in the background. I'm the customer service person, but I also get to teach, which I love. I met Roshi in 1996, actually. I had been doing Tibetan Buddhist practice for several years in Seattle. But the company I owned there, I traveled a lot for that company, and all around the West Coast of the United States. And I had a lot of business here in the Salt Lake area, but everywhere I went, I would stop in, I'd look up whatever Zen or Tibetan places were in each city. And if I had time, I'd go sit with them or listen to a talk or whatever, or just check it out. And so I had an opportunity to hear a lot of teachers during that time. It was very interesting over a 3 or 4 year period. San Francisco Zen Center, Los Angeles Zen Center, of course, Salt Lake, and then Minnesota, and New York, and Florida, and all over the place. When they're all a little different, Buddhism, like many religions, has split into a lot of different styles. Sometimes a long time ago, like when Buddhism came to Tibet or to China or to Japan, and it took on the characteristics of those societies and those cultures. And so that's why you see that the Tibetans, wear orange and yellow, or yellow and red robes, and the Chinese have a lot of gold and things, and the Japanese, aesthetic is kind of more austere, and we wear black and white robes, and it's very much a Japanese kind of look to it. And yet, the underlying teachings are exactly the same in every one, and many of all the teachings, but even many of the practices are pretty much the same, with different emphasis. Tibetans do a lot of chanting. The Chinese do a lot of sutra reading and things like that. The Zen, Japanese Zen, we do a lot of sitting meditation. Zen, the word Zen actually means meditation, and when we say Zazen, that means sitting meditation. And one of the things I wanted to do in this course was to distinguish between the principles of Buddhism and the practices of Buddhism. Okay, because they are 2 different things, and it relates back to this sort of basic process of Buddhism, which is realization and actualization. So we have we want to realize the principles, and we actualize those through the practices. Okay, to bring those realizations to life in our own lives. And I think in the West, this has been a debate here in the US and probably in Europe for decades of, how is Buddhism going to look in Western culture? Just like it took on the attributes and trappings of Tibet and China and Japan and Vietnam and other places. So how's it going to look here, Well, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to be on Zoom. And I'll still wear my rock suit, when I teach, but the rest of the time I'm wearing t-shirts and jeans, and so there's a transformation taking place. And even here in the United States and in Europe, there are some Zen centers that are still quite formal in terms of the Tibetan style or the Japanese Zen style. Not a lot of Chinese Buddhism here. So those are the two ones that people are most familiar with in the West. And some, like I say, have really retained a lot of that look and feel, and some have gone quite casual like us, and others. But they still, like I say, have the same teachings of the principles and the same teachings of practices. Some new practices have come along, most notably the big mind process that Roshi does, which is really derived from a long time ago, and a tradition of this sort of one-on-one work or group work with people, mostly on the obstacles that come up to realization. There's not a lot of obstacles to the practice of meditation, of zazen, sitting meditation. Everybody kind of knows what that is. That's a practice. There's a lot of confusion about proper or recommended, you might say, posture and times. How much time should I spend and that kind of thing, and how should I sit? And we can get into that kind of stuff later. But going back to the principles, it really all starts with the Buddha and the Four Noble Truths. And I'm sure all of you know those. They're his realizations. But let's start before that a little bit with his intention. Here's a person who was raised wealthy and insulated from much of the pain and suffering of the surrounding areas in India, which was a poor agricultural economy. And most of the people worked in the fields, and had a hard life. They didn't have health care. They had, somewhat of that, particularly from the Hindu traditions of Ayurvedic medicine and things like that. But they didn't have modern medicine, and they were subject to the diseases that come around. And, working physical labor all your life is also very difficult. Takes a toll on the body. They were people. They were people just like us. And so they had their relational problems. They had their interactions with their family and their co-workers and community, and with the kinds of governments they had then, which were feudal. And the Buddha's family was, they said his father was a king, but in those days in India, pretty much every valley was a kind of a little feudal zone of its own with its own king, and there were multiple ones of those, and they would have wars between each other and that kind of thing. So many of the problems that those people faced then are the same problems we face today, and maybe in different ways a little bit. But when the Buddha was finally, the famous story that he had one of his servants sneak him out of the castle or out of their grounds, and into the surrounding villages. He was quite shocked to see people starving, people with diseases, people who had lost limbs, people who were mentally ill, people suffering in all sorts of different ways, and he just didn't even realize this existed. And yet something inside of him at the beginning, he had his own suffering, because being a human gives you a fundamental feeling of kind of dissatisfaction. You might not be like outright suffering, but we all think that things just aren't quite right, that my life isn't quite right, that there's something missing, that there's something that I want to fix. And of course, he was married, had some children, and had all the people around, the servants and everything around, and they had their own interpersonal problems, of course, and those kind of things. So, but when he went out into the world and saw all the rest of the kinds of suffering that people of the lower classes, you might say, or well, there was quite a caste system then, were going through, he made a vow to himself to get to the bottom of the issue of suffering, of this feeling, this fundamental feeling of dissatisfaction. And from that feeling of dissatisfaction, people take action, and they will do all sorts of things to make themselves feel better, and some good and some not so good. And as a part of that, the various psychological problems that people have, the kinds of decisions they make about how to run their life, whether they are going to be passive or aggressive, or passive aggressive, if they're going to be, bullies, if they're going to be manipulating, all these kinds of things. And but every decision people make is, in their mind anyway, intended to feel better. And it might be, well, I'm going to have one more drink, or I'm going to steal something, or I'm going to whatever, all the different things that people do that sometimes are crimes, and sometimes are unethical, and sometimes are just not good choices. And their intent is to feel better in that moment, but the many times long-term effect, and a lot of times short-term effect, is actually making things worse. So he went out and left the castle, left his wife and family, everybody. And of course, India, is famous for all sorts of different gurus, and there's hundreds of flavors of Hindu and pre-Hindu sort of religions and philosophies. And he went from teacher to teacher and asked him his questions, just like all of us do, and took on their practices and studied their principles, and was never quite got to the bottom of it, and went to a number of different teachers, tried all sorts of different things. We ended up with kind of a group of buddies who were also doing this, and they'd each taken on their method, and some of it was meditation, but some of it was starvation, basically, and denying the desires of the body, because in Hindu religion, a lot of it is attributed to these desires that we have, these sort of uncontrollable urges and life drives, and that many of them thought that if they just denied themselves food and sex and any kind of pleasures and things like that, that this would cure this problem of the feeling of dissatisfaction and suffering. I think and this is not all completely accurate historically, but he spent a number of years, we know, trying these different practices and going off in the woods and starving himself and meditating, and they rub ashes on their body, or they whip themselves, or they crawl on the ground for miles, or whatever, to try to break their own spirit in a way. And none of it really worked for him. Finally, one day, he was exhausted and emaciated and up against a tree sitting, and the young girl came by and she saw him and felt really sorry for him. She ran back to the village and she got a bowl of rice and milk and honey and brought it back to him and fed him. And he was very impressed by her kindness and went ahead and ate, and probably felt better right away. And then also realized that the practices he'd been doing, weren't working. And that to starve yourself or to punish yourself or to do those things just isn't the way. And it wasn't long after that as feeling healthier again and sitting meditation more and more, he finally had the realization that made him the Buddha. And his realization was first an acknowledgement that life includes suffering. So that's the first noble truth. Life is full of suffering. And of course, we have a little joke about that I heard from a comedian. He said, you know why families are so messed up? They're full of people. And you could say that about the Sangha, or you could say that about anything, right? So the first noble truth, it was an acknowledgement that this is the problem he's trying to solve. The Buddha was never trying to solve the problem of, is there a God, or is there heaven and hell, or are these kind of metaphysical questions that nobody's ever answered and are unanswerable. And he famously denied, even for many years after he was teaching, he famously refused to answer those kind of questions, and was really focused on the issue of human suffering. So the second noble truth was the cause of suffering. And he saw in his realization that the cause of suffering is the results of desires, but the desires that also produce expectations and attachments. Okay. And then the third noble truth is, well, there is a way out of this. Now that he understands what it is, there is a way out, and the way out is the Eightfold Path, which comes after the Four Noble Truth, is the Eightfold Path. Because his followers said, they realized his enlightenment, and they said, but you have to teach us, you have to find a way to teach us how to get there, And so he spent some time and came up with the Eightfold Noble Path, which is basically its own set of things to realize: right view, right action, right speech, right livelihood, right concentration, those kind of things. You probably are familiar with those, and they're easy to look up. And so that was the first kind of connection between a realization and actualization. Like through the Eightfold Noble Path, this is how, if we study that and work with that along with the realizations we have, then this will actualize into a life of enlightened behavior and enlightened action in the world. And some people look at the Eightfold Path and they say, well, that's like the Buddhist 10 Commandments. Well, not really. And also I would say that the 6 paramitas that I know we've studied with Roshi are very much aligned with, and maybe even an offshoot of the Eightfold Noble Path, and either one is going to get you squared away that way. The 6 paramitas are basically framed as, this is the behavior of an enlightened person, that they're patient, they're generous, they're diligent, they're disciplined, they're et cetera, et cetera. So I know in the West, there's not much, the people that come up to me and find out I'm a Buddhist and want to know about it and stuff, just they don't really have a clue about any of these kind of things. And that's why we're here, of course, is to teach that stuff. But I want to go back to more first about the principles, because I think we do have to start there, and the practices and the Eightfold Path and the paramitas and things are things that we will have a better grasp of after realizing the principles. And by the principles, I mean realizations of impermanence, emptiness, oneness, dependent arising, karma or cause and effect, and this idea of the relative and absolute. Those are kind of the 6 or 7 fundamental realizations. And when these realizations are penetrated deeply and experienced deeply, then the behavior of an enlightened person, as outlined like in the 6 paramitas, comes naturally. You, instead of being told you shouldn't kill, you just don't want to kill. Instead of being told that you shouldn't steal, you just don't want to. It arises internally and expresses itself in that kind of behavior. So that's what I want to point out, that's very, very different from the Christian model, for example, of like the 10 Commandments, where just do these things and we're not really going to explain how or why that can come about naturally. So much of Western law is kind of based on that, okay, here's the rules, and if you don't do them, you're going to get punished. And rather than working with people on how to have these realizations first, and then the rest comes naturally. I read a thing the other day that I thought was very interesting. It said the easiest way to mismanage your life is to misunderstand it. It's a very interesting statement, right? And the Buddha talks about, greed, anger, and ignorance. And when he says ignorance, he doesn't mean that you're dumb or stupid or not well read, but that you haven't had these realizations of how things actually are. And those realizations of how the universe actually is and how life actually is will allow these behaviors to come out naturally, actualize. So realization, actualization. So how am I doing so far? Okay. I meant at the beginning to ask you, what you hope to get from this class, because I can ramble on forever about these things, but then maybe I won't cover something you really want to know. And I launched into my talk before I had a chance to ask that, but maybe I'll ask that now. And is there anything that it sounds like I'm not going to cover that you'd like to know about? Yes, Nicola. You guys can just leave your mics on. You
Okay.
guys can just leave your mics on. And
All right. I was introduced to Big Mind via Ken Wilber. I saw I did some work. I was doing some work with Shadow with what his sort of view was, and then it moved into Big Mind and seeing Genpo. So I feel I've come in part way along. So this for me is so valuable to go back and see the actual origins. Although I've totally embraced the thing, I like to know where things come from. So that's my mindset, I suppose. So that's what I'm thinking. So this is perfect for me. That's what I would say.
great. Well, Nicola, you and I have a lot in common that way.
Okay.
And I'm also a big fan of Ken Wilber's and have read pretty much all of his books. And, you know, going back to my history a little bit, you know, when I first met Genpo Roshi in 1996, it was because I happened to be in town and I stopped in for one of his talks. And when I went in there, I was nervous because, first of all, it was very much a monastery at that time, and everybody had their robes on and everybody was silent and everybody was very serious looking, you know. And in one way I was a little intimidated, but in another way I was like, okay, this is the real deal. You know, these people are like really into this, and so this must be the real thing. And I had enough Buddhist background to kind of know, you know, a little bit about it, but yeah, you know, came to a retreat like once a year, or maybe a couple times a year, a couple of years, and kind of got to know people a little bit. And Roshi was very welcoming and down to earth, even at the time when everybody's wearing all their robes and everything. I came there, I think it was the second time I was there, and I just kind of, it was during the day, and I walked in, and I think it was and he was living at the Zen Center at that time. It was do you guys know Tammy, Tenkei's wife, Tenkei Roshi's wife? Okay, anyway, they have their center in Netherlands, and he was there and she was there, and she's greeted me at the door and said, "Oh, let me introduce you to Roshi." And she yells up the stairs, you know, "Roshi, there's somebody here," you know. And I'm like, oh God, I didn't want to disturb everything, you know. So he comes down the stairs in a pair of jeans and no shirt. And he comes running down the stairs, and, you know, at the time he was like really muscle bound, big, imposing dude, you know. And he goes, "Hey, what's going on?" And I go, "I just came to kind of, you know, I came to a retreat last year, but I'm going to come to another one, and I was in town and I just wanted to kind of come by." And he goes, "Oh, that's great," you know, and he's like really friendly and everything. He goes, "Well, let me show you around." And he walked me around, and I said, "Yeah, I've been here." And he says, "Well, you can come in and meditate anytime," and, you know, blah, blah, blah. But that was my first introduction to like real Western Zen, right? But then I forgot what I was talking about. Well, at any rate, they weren't talking much about the principles and things at the time. It was all about practice, you know, and they meditated all day long. But Roshi did in his talks. But I wasn't able to catch many of those, but I was impressed enough then. But then it wasn't too long afterwards that, because I was a big Ken Wilber fan even then, I heard this audio recording where Genpo Roshi was doing the Big Mind process with Ken and two other gentlemen, and I can't remember the names offhand. but and he just did like the controller and the protector, and then I think the seeking mind, and then the non-seeking mind. And I was I'm completely blown away, you know. And so then then I was a student forever. But
Yeah.
so I like to know where things come from too. And the thing about integral that I like is it really feeds my sort of intellectual curiosity about things. And it did give me a bit of a map, particularly the 4 quadrants and all that. I found I started using that even when I was reading the news and things like that, because I could see where people were coming from. The downside for me with integral was that whenever you try to make a map of existence, it's too big to map. And it gets so incredibly complicated. And once I got back to the basic principles of Buddhism and started working on that, then I didn't really, integral became more of an intellectual exercise for me, which I still appreciate. But so that's why, in today and in my classes, a lot of times I do like to get back to the basics and to the underlying principles. So the first one I mentioned, I think, is impermanence. And it's pretty easy for me or anybody to explain to someone, or for any of us to get that nothing's permanent. That there's nothing permanent in the universe. Even if you think there was a Big Bang, there was probably something before that, and ever since the Big Bang, everything's changing. The planets are flying around all over. The stars are exploding, and new stars are forming, and everything around us that we see every day is maybe not visibly decaying right in the moment, or blooming right in the moment. But if you sit there long enough, you can kind of see it. And so most people understand that. And even George Harrison wrote that, what was his song, All Things Must Pass, anyway. I'm also a big Beatle fan. So most people kind of get that, but it's not the same as having a deep realization of it, to the point where, and I think, this is where the practices come in meditation. If you're meditating and you do it kind of regularly enough, and you let go, and just like not attached to anything, you suddenly will drop deeply into that and get a very deep realization that absolutely nothing stays the same. Every atom is constantly in motion and changing. This every molecule, everything, and that's quite a profound realization. But it becomes even more profound when it turns back on yourself, because it's kind of okay to say, well, yeah, everything changes, nothing is permanent. I had a car and it was new, and then it finally decayed, and I sold it, and it went to a junkyard, and it all rusted away, and it's gone now. And but to look internally at your own physical body is fairly obvious, although most of the time we are only noticing how our exterior changes, because we see ourselves in the mirror, of course, and we get older, right? But we don't often think a lot about inside our body, until something goes wrong, and then we run to the doctor because we want that thing, we want those kidneys or heart or whatever to be permanent, and we want to get it fixed right away. And then, so the physical body is something that we can kind of ignore internally a little bit. And then our mental states. I mean, obviously our thoughts are changing constantly, and our disposition, you might say, changes constantly. Where sometimes we're bored, and then we're happy, and then we're sad, and then we're angry, and then, these kind of things are constantly changing, and they will change according to both external stimulus, right? If somebody says something nasty to us, we can get offended or angry or humiliated or sad. And we can also generate these things internally, right? We can have a thought pattern that makes me feel one way or the other. And because we somewhat control those thought patterns, just like the person who's making a decision to feel better, we have a thought pattern that leads us to some kind of action to make us feel better. Right. And sometimes those things, they start in childhood, of course, and they develop, and we develop these long held notions and habits and ways to self-soothe ourselves and to get along in the world and avoid conflict or whatever. Those kind of patterns is what the practice of big mind is really good for. And you guys have all done a lot of that and understand how that works. But the basic realization of the Buddha about impermanence also led to several other realizations that are all tie in together. So a deep experience of impermanence, in a way, makes you feel like you're not there. Because there's nothing abiding that is always there. It's just a continuum of cause and effect, right? So it leads to this sort of understanding of cause and effect, or karma, and that we're just we're a manifestation of the universe, just like everything around us, and that comes and goes, like flowers come and go, and seeds grow, and trees die, and all of that. So it all kind of ties in together. So impermanence is sort of the realization of that nothing stays the same, and then cause and effect, or karma, is a realization that of the motion of this, of the movement of this. I call it like the karmic flow of the universe and ourselves internally. And so these realizations have to happen as we, in an experience of the outside world, you might say, and also our inner world. And Ken Wilber goes into this a lot, of the interior and the exterior, right? It's very important, because we definitely have an interior world, and then there's the exterior world. Then that also leads to this concept, and it's more than a concept, but we can talk about it in this way as a concept of emptiness. And emptiness, like all these things, we're speaking in the world of the relative with our language and stuff. So it has to be experienced, but we can talk about it, and that can help guide this experience. But emptiness, when Buddhists talk about emptiness, people a lot of times have a little bit of a standoffish reaction, like, oh no, I don't want to think that everything's empty, or that emptiness is bad, and that it kind of denies any kind of purpose or meaning to life, right? But that's a very surface kind of realization, and all these things can be realized in kind of a surface way, but in Zen and Buddhism, we want to go much deeper. So emptiness really just means that because there's no single abiding permanent thing anywhere, that it's empty of that. It's empty of any intrinsic substance that doesn't change. Right.
Hmm.
And of course, people, we have this tendency to want to make order out of chaos, right? And make something permanent, most particularly ourselves. We want to think that, reincarnation, for example, right? And the Tibetans, of course, they have a big, long kind of logic trail that they put together to try to kind of explain reincarnation, but it doesn't quite hold water all the way. The way it does hold water is that if in addition to these realizations, you realize that nothing ever leaves the universe. Okay. Nothing can escape the universe. So as long as the universe has been here, all of the stuff that we are, all our chemicals and water and minerals, and even our thoughts and our actions and karma never leaves the universe. So there's a certain wonderful wholeness and perfectness to it all. And so when you think of impermanence and emptiness, sometimes people, if they don't go deep enough into it, it can become sort of nihilistic. Like, well, then nothing matters. So screw it. I'm just going to live, I'm going to do whatever I want, or I'm going to kill myself, or I'm going to, it goes very negative and nihilistic if it's not thoroughly realized. And so that's why these things tie in together. So emptiness and is also wholeness and completeness, and that everything just recycle. I believe in recycling, not in reincarnation, actually. That everything just recycles. And I think it's pretty obvious, and I don't think it's ever been disproven that I know of, or made to look like it can't be proven or is not true. I think it's just true. My experience. So emptiness and oneness kind of go hand in hand, because if all the material of the universe, including our thoughts and moods and everything else, never leaves, then it's all there. And so emptiness and fullness or completeness are really also one thing. It's the difficulties of our language that make this a little hard to explain or to get your head around, which is why in Zen we continuously push that the personal experience is what matters. The personal direct experience of these things is what gets you there. It's not the thinking about it. The thinking about it can get you started, and that's great, and that's why we do these classes. So impermanence, emptiness, oneness. If you're made up of the same stuff as all the rest of the universe, then of course you're one with it. How could you be anything other than one with it? Whether you realize it or not is the issue, right? And of course, we've made ourselves into these separate beings that are trying to create order out of this chaos, and trying to make a permanent self and a permanent life and a never-ending existence. But you've already had a never-ending existence, and you will continue to have a never-ending existence. Only it'll just be in all these different forms. Like it's really easy to see, like when you die, your body, we know what happens to the body, and you might be cremated and scattered out somewhere important to people, or you might just decay in a hole and become part of the worms and bacteria, and then they die off and they become part of the next worms and bacteria, and the whole thing is just this huge mushing around of stuff. And in a physical way, it's kind of easy to see that, but it's a little harder to grasp that our thoughts and emotions and our actions and all those things are also part of that, and intrinsically part of that, and never ending, and all have karmic effects. everything we do has a karmic effect that ripples out. And so does everybody else's, and every tree and every bird and everything that moves and everything that doesn't move is all part of it. Has its own karmic place. And it's hard, I think, for people sometimes to think, and Roshi often says everything is perfect as it is, just as it is. And it is so true. But why do we have suffering? Why do we feel a certain dissatisfaction? This is exactly the point that the Buddha was going after. Because he saw that these things are true, but then he saw the reason for the suffering is because we don't kind of believe it. And we don't believe it because we haven't spent the time to have a direct experience of it. So then they came up with the practices. So principles and practices again. Another one of these that I mentioned is dependent arising. This also ties in to help explain, why do I have a phone? Where did it come from? It's also made up of all the same stuff I am, in different amounts and different shape and everything. But it's because when you mush all this stuff together over time and it's all coming together and coming apart, then things manifest, things come out of that, and they all depend on the rest of it. So a tree, for example, came from a seed that came from another tree that came from another seed that came from another tree. But it requires sunshine and water and air, and of course, so do we. And all these things have to come together for anything to manifest. So for one thing to be able to manifest, that means everything else has had to manifest. It's crazy, but wonderful, right? And what an amazing thing it all is. And it's really ungraspable intellectually. We can talk about it, and we can think about it, but the direct experience of that is what really sinks it in and really makes you feel one. Now, one of our practices, of course, is koan study. And koan study is almost completely directed toward these same principles. And it works in a way that requires you to drop your sort of our self-centered separateness identity, you might say, because you can really only answer the koan by dropping that. And it's the same with these other realizations. You can only realize these things by dropping the notion of independent, separate self. Yeah, not much more I can say about that, but dependent arising, everything requires everything else. And even though it may be very remote, it's still that you can still connect the dots all the way through in every possible direction. North, south, east, west, up, down. It's all one big thing. And how beautiful is it that as humans, we can actually even somehow through evolution, we've been able to get to the point where we can actually get into these things and actually kind of complete that circle of not only being it, but seeing it and letting that instruct us and letting that actualize and not resisting it and flowing with it, and just when you feel oneness, it's much easier to flow along with it and not resist everything, because all of our resistance is just another way to make us separate. So the last thing, I'll cover on this principles part is another difficult one, which is this idea of relative and absolute. And, Roshi has the triangle thing that he does, which I think is very nice for this. But basically what happens with realization is, and what the Buddha saw was that the pre-existing state of the universe is what we would call the absolute. Okay, all these things that I'm talking about, that it's impermanent, that it's empty, that it's one, that dependent arising, and the workings of karma is why we see things and experience things. So that's kind of the ground of being. I think it's referred to a lot of times, particularly in Tibetan, I think. The actual fundamental truth of things is the absolute. Okay. And it's something that we can experience. The relative is everything that humans have kind of laid on top of this. Okay. So it's not really a separate world. There are no separate worlds. Everything's one thing. But in our language and our ability to work with each other and talk to each other, we are limited by our language. And so we can separate these things into relative and absolute. So the relative view is just exists in everybody's mind. And it's different in everyone's mind. We have some certain common ground because we all speak English, let's say, and we, or whatever language, and we can relate to these kind of things through that. But even the language and everything is just a map that's on top of what's actually what is, which is the absolute world and the way it actually is. So, and even the relative is actually actually included in the absolute. But when we separate it out in order to have a better idea about why we feel separate. Okay, if we can look at how the relative works, how our relative minds work. So, and you guys have been around, it's basically explained that we look at everything as either up or down or left or right or good or bad or hot or cold. We separate everything, which is we separate all the things that are fundamentally and basically and forever have been inseparable. We do this in our language and in our the way we look at things, and so from the relative side, you don't really get the absolute. It's like, no, everything's this or that or the other. I just, that's the way it is. But from the absolute, looking at the relative, you just have to go, ha ha ha. Wow, look at this crazy map that we have of the absolute, Like if I'm the absolute, I would say, look at what these people have made up about me. That only exists in the minds of these humans on this one little planet. It might exist everywhere if there's other life forms, and it's not to put it down. It's not to say that that's wrong. It's just to see it for what it is. Also, that, okay, this is a way of communicating and working in the world and, having jobs and living life and putting food in your mouth and everything else like that. It's a way we've developed, and civilization is developed on top because of this ability to do that. It comes with a definite downside, which is it creates a constant conflict. The relative world is the world of continuous conflict, of separating things out, the good, bad, up, down, right, left, okay? And many more subtle variations of that. Another example I like to use is in the absolute world, there's no measurement of anything. I mean, in the actual state of the universe, there's no measure, there's no feet or inches, there's no Celsius or Fahrenheit. There's none of that. These are human inventions. And this is like when Nicola, when you mentioned integral, integral is a very, very detailed one of these relative maps.
Mhm.
And it's not that it isn't useful, and it's not that it isn't a part of the rest of the world. It is. But it has to be seen for what it is and the limitations of that. And the limitations is that this is the world where suffering occurs. Okay, because in the relative view, because we think of things are good or bad or right or left or up or down, then from that we will make judgments and build structures of value structures, that this is more valuable than that, or that's more valuable than this, and that is true also. But if you ignore one for the other, it's not good. So if I'm completely lost in the absolute view and have dismissed the relative, I'm not going to be able to function very well, at all, right? Because for the safety of myself and my family and living life, I have to make these kind of value judgments. If I'm completely lost in the relative world, I have no connection to what is. And so my relative judgments are going to be, they're going to go off in all kinds of different directions for good or ill. So this is why I think Roshi's triangle is so brilliant, because it's a way that we can first conceptualize and then maybe have deep realization of the oneness of the whole triangle, that the relative and the absolute are one, the apex, you might call it, which is the blending of both. This is all one thing, and it all has its value and usefulness and truth all put together. So that being said, we aren't trained in these things as we grow up, and hardly anybody in the world is. The Tibetans are the only ones I know of where they send 4-year-olds to the monastery, and it's their school, and it's the government, they feed them, they healthcare, everything is through the monastery, and they start teaching them these things very, very young. And this is maybe why their society and the society of Nepal, Nepal is almost always at the top of the list of the most happy countries, because they have this fundamental grounding in the reality of things. In the West, though, it's all relative, all the time from day one, and these things aren't even addressed. And it's interesting because I have some good friends who are Christians who are really open to like talking about things in the Bible and this and that from a different perspective. And there are places in Christian teaching and Bible teachings that point to this. And one of them is the story of the Garden of Eden. Believe it or not. The Garden of Eden, of course, at first, whether you believe that God created these people and put them in the garden or not, it's symbolic. And this was prior, they were there prior to having relative or relative thinking, right? Dualistic thinking. They're just in the garden and they're eating and stuff, and God says, but just don't eat the apple from this tree of knowledge, the knowledge of right and wrong, the knowledge of good and evil. Do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is directly pointing to, don't go to this relative thing. It's going to make you really unhappy. But they did. And so then, according to this symbolic story in the Bible, suddenly relative thinking blossomed or occurred somehow in humans, and they suffered from then on. And the whole rest of the Bible is all full of killing and wars and horrible things, right? And so then the 10 Commandments come along where they try to say, wait, you can't live like this. You got to follow these rules and we'll get everything straightened out again. We can't really get rid of the relative thinking, so it's been interesting conversations I have with these guys. But I think the Buddha had it right, and I think it's much clearer the way he put it, to see that the like pre-existing condition or the fundamental state of the universe is empty and full and changing and all these kind of things, and that we can see the relative view for what it is, which can be quite useful and can be quite harmful. And this is the area that we work on. And we work on having the relative have a better and more true actualization and operation in the world by remembering where it came from and what it's there for, and we can decide its proper use. But it has to come internally. It doesn't come from being ordered to do this or that or the other thing, because there's too many variables, there's too many exceptions to these rules, right? So, like I say, it starts from the inside, actualizes in a proper way. And so our ethics and morals should come from this place, right? Okay. That's about all I have to say.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. So that's a bit of an overview of maybe what we'll cover over the next 3 weeks, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so I would just say, think about what not what we've talked about, but what I've talked about. I've talked the whole time. And let's get into it and have questions. And we didn't really talk about the practices, but I don't know that there's much for me to tell you guys about actual practices, unless you want to get into further about koans or big mind, or I think you guys know how to meditate. But these are all practices that are designed to break through our barriers that are built up in the relative side.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
You're very
Thank
welcome.
you.
Okay, see you next week.
Yeah, sure.
Next
See you.
week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.